Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is The Chocolate War by Robert Cormier. Now, is it pronounced Cormier or Cormier? I always used to pronounce it as Cormier, but recently I heard his name pronounced as Cormier. Cormier is probably how it's actually pronounced, but because I'm a dumbass, I'm probably going to constantly refer to him as Cormier in this video. Now, if you've noticed that it's been some time since my last review, it's not because this book took me that long to read, it's because I'm currently going back and forth between two different books. I'm currently rereading Stephen King's The Stand, and I'm also reading The 120 Days of Sodom by the Marquis de Sade, and that's probably going to be a pretty interesting review when I eventually get done with it, but I wanted to get another review out in a reasonable time frame, and I realized that I wasn't going to finish either of those books in that time. So I decided to read The Chocolate War, figuring that it should be a pretty quick read, especially because I really loved Robert Cormier's other novel, I Am the Cheese. Now, The Chocolate War is a young adult novel published in 1974, and this is considered to be a classic of the young adult genre, which admittedly is not a genre I typically gravitate towards, at least not the newer young adult novels. But the few 70s young adult novels that I've read are surprisingly really good. Honestly, I think shit like Twilight really kind of killed the young adult genre, at least in terms of the genre actually being taken seriously. But what I really like about Robert Cormier's stories, at least the two that I've read, is even though these are written for younger readers, he's not afraid to get dark, and he's also not afraid to be pessimistic, and there's something really haunting about both this and I Am the Cheese. Now, what the plot of The Chocolate War is, it's set at an all-boys Catholic high school called Trinity, and we follow this freshman named Jerry Renault, who is already dealing with depression because of the death of his mother. And at the school, there's this club, or sort of secret society, who call themselves the Vigils, and basically what they do is they give other students assignments, and the Vigils are basically bullies. Like, they pressure other students into performing these often cruel pranks on either other students or even some of the teachers. And one of the members of the Vigils is this boy named Archie Costello, who is the assigner. He's the one who gives out these assignments to other students, and even though he's not officially the leader of the Vigils, more and more you start to realize that he might as well be, because he really is the one calling the shots because of how manipulative he is. But one day, Jerry gets an assignment from the Vigils. He's to refuse to partake in Brother Leon's annual chocolate sale. Brother Leon is one of the teachers at the school who you find out is borderline abusive towards his students, and he also takes this chocolate sale maybe a little more seriously than he should, but you also find out that he kind of spent money that he shouldn't have on these chocolates. But Jerry's only supposed to refuse to partake in this chocolate sale for a certain number of days, but when those days are finally up, he still decides that he doesn't want to sell chocolates, and this really angers Brother Leon. And Brother Leon is kind of in cahoots with the Vigils, and he tries to get the Vigils, specifically Archie, to pressure Jerry into selling these chocolates. And more Jerry refuses, and this sort of becomes an act of rebellion for Jerry. Like, he refuses to conform, and the Vigils are trying to get him to conform. And this includes bullying and sending him harassing phone calls in the middle of the night that start to take a real toll on his mental health, and not just his mental health, but his father's as well. Now, The Chocolate War very much deals with themes of bullying, and it's interesting that this came out the same year as Stephen King's Carrie. Granted, that's a very different novel from this. Carrie is a supernatural horror story, whereas this is more of a reality-based drama, but both novels ostensibly do deal with bullying, and keep in mind, this was at a time when bullying was not really a topic that was taken that seriously in the media. But the book is also about conformity and abuse, and how the system can sometimes allow or even reward abusive behavior, hence the character of Brother Leon. It's interesting how the book was written not that long after the 1960s, because there is sort of this subtle undercurrent of the counterculture movement. Like, at one point, Jerry is caught staring at these hippies, and there are references to demonstrations that have happened in the past. And in the novel, you see how Jerry tries to go up against this establishment, but is ultimately destroyed by this establishment. This whole idea that people who try to go up against the system can be chewed up and spat back out. But that's not to say that the book is pro-establishment. I think quite the opposite, because the Vigils and the school are clearly shown to be the bad guys. Like, it's a really pessimistic novel. Like, there's really no happy endings in this book, which I actually really appreciated, considering that this is a young adult novel. This is a book being written for younger readers, but Robert Cormier is not afraid to say, yeah, life fucking sucks. Now, there's an interesting scene in the book where Brother Leon accuses one of his students of cheating, and the kid stands his ground saying, no, I did not cheat, but he turns the entire class against this kid, but then he turns on the class saying, this kid stood his ground while all of you just followed my lead, and he tells his students that they turned his class into Nazi Germany for a second, so he has sort of this, like, anti-conformist message for his class, but when you read the book, you realize, no, conformity is exactly what he wants. It's also interesting how Brother Leon accuses Jerry of being apathetic and accuses him of spreading apathy to the other students. Meanwhile, Brother Leon is completely apathetic to the things that the Vigils are doing. Now, the novel has two primary antagonists. You have Brother Leon, who I would say is sort of the overarching antagonist, but ultimately he's the secondary antagonist compared to Archie, who is the true villain of the novel, especially when you see how Archie does kind of manipulate Brother Leon as well. And Archie is a real nasty character. He's basically a pure sociopath, and he torments the other kids at the school psychologically. Like, he bullies people more with the brain rather than the brawn. And it's interesting how the other Vigils fucking hate him, yet he's so cunning and so manipulative that he's still able to get what he wants from them. And Archie gets away with so much that it is almost a little unrealistic. Like, if this were a supernatural story, you would almost swear that this kid is the devil or something. Now, being that this is set at a Catholic school, you could maybe pick out some religious undertones with that. Like, you could even say Jerry is sort of a Christ-like figure, especially towards the end of the book. Another interesting character in the book is a character named Goobert, who goes by the nickname the Goober, who ends up being Jerry's best friend in the novel, and towards the beginning of the story, he's tasked by the Vigils to play a prank on a teacher named Brother Eugene, and when he plays this prank on Eugene, this ends up affecting the teacher so much that the guy has an emotional breakdown and takes a leave of absence, and Goobert feels such guilt over what he did, and I think empathy and apathy are also major themes in the book, where you see Goobert being really the only one who feels any sort of empathy towards one of the victims of these pranks, whereas the Vigils are completely apathetic towards the people they hurt, and yet you have Brother Leon, whose definition of apathy is not taking part in a stupid-ass chocolate sale. But yeah, The Chocolate War is a very good book, and I highly recommend it, even if you're not typically a fan of young adult fiction, because I'm not really a fan of young adult fiction either, but this is a book that you should definitely check out. Now, Robert Cormier's novel, I Am the Cheese, which I mentioned before, was written as sort of a follow-up to this, but Robert Cormier would do a direct sequel to this in 1985 called Beyond the Chocolate War, which I still have not yet read. Now, this was adapted into a 1988 film film of the same name. Now, the movie was written and directed by Keith Gordon, who is primarily known for being an actor. Actually, prior to that, he played Arnie in John Carpenter's adaptation of Stephen King's Christine. Now, in the movie, Jerry was played by Ilan Mitchell-Smith, who most people might recognize from Weird Science, and he was really good in the movie. And in speaking of Weird Science, I've actually heard people refer to the movie The Chocolate War as almost like an anti-John Hughes film, which I could definitely see, whereas John Hughes' teen movies were usually sort of optimistic and upbeat. This was a very dour, very pessimistic teen movie. In the movie, Archie was played by Wallace Langham, who just freaking oozes evil whenever you see him on screen. You also have the great John Glover as Brother Leon, who just steals every scene he's in. In the movie, Obie, who is Archie's right-hand man, is played by Doug Hutchinson, who people might recognize as Percy Wetmore from The Green Mile, but X-Files fans would probably recognize him as Tooms, one of the greatest X-Files villains of all time, despite only showing up in 2 episodes. The movie also stars Adam Baldwin in a small role, as well as Bud Cort in a small but memorable role. Now, the movie, for the most part, is remarkably faithful to the book. However, it does change the ending a little bit, and you could mistake it for a happy ending, because Archie does get his comeuppance at the end of the movie, whereas he doesn't in the book. However, it's still not really a happy ending if you're really paying attention to the subtext. But the movie is actually really good. It's a solid adaptation of the book, but it's also a really good movie on its own. The movie also has these surreal dream sequences, which are really well done. But yeah, that was my review on The Chocolate War by Robert Cormier, or Cormier. Again, I'm not really sure how to properly pronounce his last name, and bye.